Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial. This time I'm going to be teaching you how to maintain your Doppler clutch pulley. The Doppler clutch pulley is probably the most favored aftermarket part for the Motobecane, Peugeot, and any other modified mopeds that you can fit it onto. So when you get your clutch pulley, the first thing you want to do is take it apart. Now this is a modified clutch pulley, so there will be a little bit differences between stock and this modified one, but I'll go over it and tell you what exactly you should be doing. And you definitely want to make these modifications not only for performance reasons, but you want to make them for safety and reliability reasons. So let's get started. First thing you're going to need is your clutch pulley off the bike, of course, and a socket drive that will fit this nut on the front. So front clutch pulley nut, and in the rear for stock there will be, I believe they're 10mm nuts, so you will need a 10mm socket nut. These are modified castle nuts, so for the Tomahawk clutch brace, and they're 13mm. So I'm not going to take these off, but just to be aware of the differences there. So first thing you want to do is get this nut off, and it is a right-handed nut, so you turn left to loosen it. Let's move on to the vise, and I'll show you how to take it off. Okay, so we're here at the vise station, and in order to remove the nut off of the pulley, we're going to have to clamp down onto the sprocket. Now, if you're uncomfortable with that, the proper way to remove this is to get some extra chain that you have, 415 chain, and just wrap it around here. This way you can clamp it into the vise without marring up the sprocket teeth. So get it nice and tight, and you can use some propane heat if you like. Make sure you get it on the clutch bell and the nut, not inside the shaft and not anywhere too far away. Reason is there's roller bearings inside the shaft and you don't want to melt them, and you also don't want to melt your clutch pads. So you can use some heat, get it on here, and get your socket drive. This is a 1 1/4 inch 12-point socket. I don't remember what they are for in terms of millimeters, but this is probably readily available at any hardware store. If you're finding that you can't get enough torque to remove this nut, because they are tightened down very, very, very well, you can get a wrench with a hole on the bottom and loop it inside to get yourself some more torque. So rotate to the left to loosen, and I've already done the job for us, so it makes it easy. Keep in mind, if you used heat, to wear gloves, or be aware that it is probably very hot. So now that we've gotten this loosened up, here is our nut. This is the same size nut and threading for all of the Doppler variators and the Bigelow variator and the Melosi variotop as well. So let's go back to the table. Alright, so we're back at our table, and we've let our clutch bell cool off so that way we don't burn our hands off. And you want to be aware that the clutch shaft here has two flat spots. Flat spot here and flat spot here. And that's so that way the clutch bell can fit on the shaft without rotating itself away from the shaft, because the shaft and the clutch bell have to move together. Now sometimes if you're taking this off after you've used this for a season, this may be torqued a little bit on the shaft, so just be aware of that. You want to untorque it back so that way you can pull off the clutch bell. So luckily this has not moved at all, and you just take a screwdriver and walk it so that way you can get the clutch bell moving off of the shaft. And when you have enough space, just remove the clutch bell. So we'll set this to the side for now, and we'll go on to the inside. Keeping in mind that this is a modified pulley, your stock pulley will not have this brace. This is the Tomahawk clutch brace. Maybe I'll do a tutorial on how to install that clutch brace at some time, but for now we'll just ignore and pretend that it's not there. So for your clutch pads, they are all attached to one pin. 3 clutch pads, 3 pins. And each pin has a circlip. You want to remove those circlips so that way you can remove this pad if you wanted to change out springs or whatever. So we'll remove these circlips very quickly. Alright, so when you have a stock clutch pulley, this is pretty much what it looks like once you remove your clutch bell. You have your pins, we removed the circlips, and your springs. These are aftermarket springs. The stock springs, I believe they allow the clutches to engage at around 6,000 to 8,000 RPM. These springs allow the clutches to engage somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 RPM. So they're tuned for my bike, and if you want, I can make a tutorial on how to change out the springs and get them all in tip-top shape and performance for your bike. You don't want to just throw on high tension springs onto a stockish bike, so you do need some sort of at least mild or high performing bike in order to fully use the high revving clutch pads or high engaging clutch pads. Okay, so when maintaining this, you want to get down to the bearing that's on the inside of the pulley. It sits in here, pressed inside, and there's a circlip that holds the shaft in place. So we'll remove this circlip that's on the inside. I've already slightly removed it so I can easily pull it out. And we'll set the shaft to the side for now. And here's your circlip. Mine has the grooves cut off, so it does make it very difficult for me to remove this. Now we have our shaft, and on the inside is the bearing, which we can see here. If you notice, this bearing is not stock. This bearing is actually a little bit wider than the stock bearing. And you can see here on the shaft, you have 2 circlip positions. Now, the stock circlip position is the one that's closest to the sprocket. So from here, the end of the sprocket, or the end of where the sprocket meets the shaft, to the circlip is how wide that bearing is. The aftermarket bearing, which I'll put a link in the description, I think it's HFL 3031 or 3030. It's the one-way bearing. You don't want the two-way bearing, you want the one-way bearing. I'll repeat, the one-way bearing. That is wider. Now you want the wider bearing for longevity and reliability. It keeps the pulley from side-to-side motion as you're using it, so it's much more stable when you have the wide bearing. And I'll do a tutorial on pressing in that bearing and removing the old one. But for now, we'll just keep in mind that we have an aftermarket one. Yes, HFL 3030. So, next you want to remove your nuts here. On the stock one, these are 10mm nuts. And remove your clutch pads off of each pin. Now for stock, this is actually pretty easy. The springs aren't don't have too much tension, but I'm not going to do it just because it's such a pain to put these back on. But you want to remove these pads off and unscrew the shaft. There's like 2 flat spots on each shaft at the base. You can take a wrench and just unscrew them off and get them out completely. Now they're 6mm thick, tapped inside to the pulley plate here. So you want to get some Loctite blue or red, preferably red, and put it on the shaft, screw it back into the plate, and then put some Loctite and lock nuts back here and tighten it the best you can without stripping everything. This will prevent the pads and pins falling out as time progresses. So if you've pressed in a new bearing, or if you just have your stock one, take some grease. I just use marine grease. Generally you want some, this is a fast moving part, so you want some sort of liquidy type grease, and just grease it on the inside of here. And there should be 3 bearings inside of the shaft. You want to grease and clean out those if you're maintaining this pulley. So clean it out, re-grease them, and re-grease your main clutch bearing. So once you have all of your pieces cleaned out, performance stuff. Inside the clutch bell, there's some chrome from when they plated these clutch bells. The bells are steel, and you want to take a Dremel pad and grind out all of the chrome all the way through. You can also go in with some good old sandpaper and just rub all that out best you can. This is so that way your pads can grab onto the clutch bell more easily and don't slip around unnecessarily. So grind all that stuff out, clean it out. If you're maintaining it, make sure that it hasn't glazed over, unglaze it, or deglaze it rather. Check your pads. If you installed a spring, aftermarket spring, and you're finding that the pads are sticking too much, cut some grooves into your pads, pointing them towards the pulley, and this way, I'll show you in another direction, downward. This way the heat escapes the pads where they are touching. Keeps your pads in good shape and keeps the heat out of the clutch bell. Don't want too much heat glazing these over. Another thing you can do is drill some hole slots into your clutch bell. I'll do a tutorial on that at some point when I go get a new clutch bell and make some new holes. These are just venting holes so that way your pads again don't heat up and cause them to stick prematurely. You always want your pads to grab consistently. Okay, so now that we've either drilled holes into our clutch bell, removed the chrome off of the clutch bell, changed out our bearings, changed out our springs, vented and slotted our clutch pads and made sure that our clutch pads are still in good shape. One last thing you can do is put a little bit of grease on each pin where the clutch pad will be sitting on, so that way it can move freely. So after all of that, we're going to reassemble everything. So we've greased up our bearing, put it back on the shaft, and we'll put our circlip pin back in. Again, this will be difficult for me because of the fact that my pins do not have there we go. Do not have the holes. Push it all the way down. Remember, if you are stock, the first clip position is not for the stock bearing. It's for the wider modified bearing. So if you have a stock bearing inside, you have to go down one more clip position. Don't forget that. Otherwise, you're all set. Put your brace back on. Highly suggest that you make a brace for these. It keeps the pins from bending away from each other at high RPM. I will say that with all of these modifications, I've taken this pulley off after 1 year. And this pulley's only ever been used for racing, so it's got about 100 to 200 hours on it. And no issues, other than clutch pads are fairly worn down. So it just goes to show you that you really want to make sure that you do all these modifications, as it will increase the reliability of your pulley. Don't forget to make sure that all of your circlip pins are in place correctly. You do not want them to fall out at high RPM, or any RPM for that matter. Alright, last pin. You have successfully finished the inside. Last step is to put on your clutch bell. Again, align it with the slots of the shaft. And push it in all the way down. You may have to walk it a little bit. Okay. Once that's all the way in, we'll take some Loctite and put it in our nut. So just some blue. If you don't plan on maintaining this often, red is probably preferred. So get this back on here. Again, wrap it up with the chain and put it on the vise. Tighten it down. And you're all good to go. One last thing and final note. When you're installing your clutch pulley back onto your shaft, make sure that you are using spacers and washers to offset the chain ever so slightly. You want to keep your chain straight. I also use thrust bearings. Now these are roller bearings that are flat, and this allows them to slide onto a washer. So I have a washer, the thrust bearing, another washer, and then the circlip which holds it all in place. So that way this can slide around without rubbing on the circlip or the washers. Just gives a little bit more freedom to move. So that's all. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or a message, and I hope you enjoyed this brief-ish tutorial on how to maintain and modify your clutch pulley.
Wow.